Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so very much for joining us today for our very special virtual roundtable on SDG 16 and the pandemic, policy and strong institutions. Today's webinar will feature an array of very important and expert panelists, and I will now be giving the floor to the inaugural remarks from Dr. Francisco Rojas Aravena. Dear Mr. Aravena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. It's a great honor to stay today in this panel. I'd like to say good morning or good afternoon there to the Executive Director of UNITAR, Seth, and also to my friend Alex Mejia for this initiative, and also our representative of the UPs in Geneva, David Fernandez Puyana. The SDG 16 probably is the most important SDG because in a space where no has peace, it's impossible to have any rights. And the COVID-19 note, as note the Secretary General, has rapidly become the worst human order in our time. After a year and a half of the pandemic, the world is now plagued by more uncertainty, less certainties, more inequity, more injustice, more difficulty in meeting with sustainable development goals. Conflict and violence are arise. At the same time, cooperation and solidarity are reduced. An unprecedented crisis is with the multilateralism emerge. In the context of war and situation of civil war, there is no possibility to exercise any rights. The institutions are destroyed. It's impossible to demand human rights in situation of armed conflict in countries fractured by violence. The 70 million of refugees are witness of that. Conflict inhibits the possibility of sustainable development. Pandemic is a major conflict for the institutionality and well-being of the societies. Pandemic produce pain and death, and it's desinstitutionalized and generates seriously root in sustainable development and the international and national institutions. Already in the report of the Secretary General referred to SDGs, referred to SDG 16, say we are still far from achieving a goal of peaceful and just and inclusive society. In the last report in 2020, the picture is similar. In a length report prepared by the United Nations referred to all the SDGs, SDG 16 present a major change in different subregions. And we saw in East and South Asia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the OCDE, the challenges are incremental. In the case, paradoxically, in the case of Latin America, in Middle East and North Africa and South Africa, the challenges are neither getting better or worse. In this region express a major challenge. That means all the sub-region confront important threats referred to SDGs and all their sub-indicators. One of the main of that referred to the homicides. And if we look in the world, 37.4% correspond to the Americas and 35.1% to Africa. In other words, the 72.5 homicides are concentrated in these two regions, in Latin America basically, and in Africa. Asia are increased and nearly the 22%. In the case of Latin America, it's extraordinary challenge this because Latin America, with 9% of the population, is responsible for the 30% of homicides. The violence is also expressed in homicides to the journalists, human rights person defenders, and environmental defenders also. According to the United Nations, like 400 people and 30 disappearances in 47 countries around the world in the last time. Also, the violence affects particularly to the woman, to the child, and domestic violence is quite important in different parts of the world. With the pandemic, this increase. The access to justice also show an important deficit in all the world. 31% of the prisoners are in jail without firm sentence made by the justice. A third aspect, it's quite important for this SDG and show negative figures, is corruption. Corruption make disinstitutionalization in any institution of democracy. Corruption opened the door to international illicit and transnational organized crime. The traffic of persons is one of the main things in that, joined with the narcotics and arms, light weapons traffic. Today, in different parts of the world, basically in the global south, has a great disaffection with the public service provided by the state in different countries. Also, with the lack of transparency in the decision-making process for national public goods in different access for information. This has made less trust for all the institutions. Trust in the government, trust in the political parties, trust in the justice has deteriorated significantly. The trust in the institution declined in the context of growing conflict. Trust is essential for institution and very good public policy. Also, in this context of growing of conflict, criminalization of the social protests are increased in the context of the pandemic, and many governments take measures to tend to militarize and polarize in the society in this situation. The weakness of multilateralism has been difficult to mediate, intercede, seek to reduce polarization and silence weapons. It's necessary the world once again occupy the central place in the promotion of the dialogue that make peace possible, that make possible to achieve positive peace. The development of the initiative like this one, promoted by UNITAR and University for Peace, allow us to recognize the difficulty to occupy conceptual frameworks inherited from the old international system previous to the pandemic. Today, it's essential to think a new concept capable to introduce innovative perspectives to address serious with the difficulty of the old SDGs, but particularly SDG 16. All conflicts are emerging with great force. They are increasing the pain, death, and generate, plus the pandemic. It's necessary to think a new form of multilateralism action to face great challenge in the international system. Here's the essence of achieve the leitmotif of the University for Peace. If we want peace, let's work for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aravena, for your valuable contribution. And next, I would like to introduce Mr. Nikhil Seth, the Executive Director of UNITAR. Mr. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Dr. Francis Roja and my own colleagues in the Division for People and his colleagues in the University for Peace for making this webinar possible. It's such a pleasure for me to be saying something in the opening part of this session. But I will start, of course, by agreeing with everything and endorsing what Dr. Rojas has said. I think he's made a very strong case for the importance of SDG 16. Those of us who are a little more purists, of course, argue that the SDGs are all indivisible and it's difficult to prioritize. But I get his point that looking at these difficult times of COVID-19 and its aftermath, it's very difficult to say that it's SDG 16 is not right on top there. And Dr. Rojas's focus on corruption, his focus on the various other aspects of SDG 16, the violation of human rights, the trafficking in people, the treatment of women, all these have been laid bare by the COVID crisis. If there was any reason to doubt all this, COVID crisis has really exposed it in such stark, is a stark reminder to all of us that without achieving all these things, without ending corruption, without good governance, and of course, I'll go into some of these aspects as I build my little opening story. But look at the crisis we are in. Before starting this meeting, I looked at the details of the present situation on COVID-19. And as of the last information I have, there are 164 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, 3.4 million deaths. And according to many sort of reports, including the latest one coming out on The Economist, this is understating the number of cases and deaths by a factor of 5. So you have to multiply this by 5 to get the true magnitude. So it is horrendous. I can't think of any comparable situation in contemporary times, say going back to the 19th century, where such devastation has wrecked our little planet. And of course, we have a ray of hope in vaccinations. Everyone is saying that vaccinations are going to solve all this. But remember, there have been only 1.3 billion vaccines administered so far. And this includes 2 doses. So there's a lot of work to be done before we cover our entire population. And there's a lot of work to do. Well, we're still unraveling what COVID-19 is doing to our planet. The health impact, the social impact, the economic impact, the environmental impact are enormous and growing. The political impact, the impact on our institutions has also been extremely severe. We have been exposed to our vulnerability. None of these problems arose because of COVID. They were there, but somehow COVID has exposed all the great inequalities, the poverty, the discrimination against women, what our societies value, because the way in which governments respond to these crises reflects their own value systems. And I must say, we've been very disappointed globally in the leadership and the response, which have exposed the weaknesses in our society. Those without access to healthcare are finding it even more difficult. Those in the education field are struggling to get some semblance of what you may call an education. And the lessons we have learned, one of the most important is that but there's a positive sign that even ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things if they are led by solidarity and compassion. We've seen country after country where they've had leadership of this nature, which have done very well. And responsible behavior have been predicated by responsible political leadership. And this leadership and responsibility have saved a lot of lives. The current pandemic has also shown the importance of strong, flexible, and accountable public institutions which can act swiftly and effectively in the case of a crisis and still preserve the principles of good governance, rule of law, and human rights. We have seen many examples of how strong institutions combined with responsible leadership in the handful of countries where this has been demonstrated can make the difference between fragility and strength, between failure and success. But the question is, what is it really that makes institutions strong? We can have the best institutional structures and means, and yet this institutional strength is defined firstly by values and the principles they embody. Every crisis, including the present pandemic, despite all its terrible impacts that I talked about, is primarily also a test of the principles and values on which our societies and our institutions stand. UN has focused its efforts on helping countries avoid the worst impacts of the pandemic while work for a strong recovery. I must say we've not been able to do as well as we should have. I don't want to rah-rah the United Nations because I work in it, but the fact is that we have done our best to muster the sort of critical mass of efforts that we need to make a change in the way we are handling the crisis, and how we can build upon the principles of universality and solidarity and inclusiveness, which are very much a part of the UN Charter and the 2030 Agenda. We in UNITAR have been trying our best. We are a small organization, a small institution, but we've been trying our best from the very beginning. We continue all these efforts. UNITAR recently developed a vaccination toolkit, focusing on helping governments and companies to design and implement campaigns to support vaccination efforts and prevent and reduce the spread of COVID-19. We worked in the area of anti-corruption. We've had a serious development of a global anti-corruption training platform with the state-of-art e-learning solutions and materials. So there are several other areas which I don't have time to cite, but we've been trying to do our best in this area of public administration, of building public institutions, on defining good governance, of looking at the kinds of things which make good governance bad, including on issues of corruption and so on. We must not use the COVID crisis to put a hold on these values that I mentioned. We need to put these values into practice. We need to strengthen these values in practical and concrete terms with tangible positive impact for the people we are out there to serve. There's no point paying lip service to all this, but to see how the actions of all of us collectively leads to the improvement in the lives of that last kilometer of people. And that's where we are finding it the most difficult to reach in these very difficult times. One element which Dr. Rojas mentioned, which I would like to emphasize, and that is the complete loss of trust. The trust of citizens with their authorities and leaders, and the hope that they're doing the right thing seems to be vanishing. There have been some positive examples that I mentioned, but largely, I would say for the bulk of humanity, they have been let down by their political leadership. We've seen all kinds of incompetence, populism, disinformation, ignoring of facts, which have had fatal consequences in terms of human lives, as well as, more importantly, the weakening of credibility and respect of institutions of authority, of governments, of political leaders among citizens. They are feeling alone. Citizens are increasingly feeling that they have to survive on their own. There is nobody who will come to their help. Nobody with remdesivir, nobody with oxygen, nobody with access to beds in hospitals. And that is the very tragic state that we have come to. And that's a real pity. I just wanted to also talk, when we talk about the post-pandemic recovery, it should be our top priority to rebuild this trust which is gone. It's not easy. It's not going to be easy. Citizens will not have that faith very easily returned to them as we rebuild, but that has to be one of the strongest focus for the credibility of our public institutions. And that is what good governance will imply in the future. Rebuild the faith in our institutions, which has disappeared. It will, of course, require responsible leadership, and that's why we need to build the capacity of institutions at all levels, build the capacity of leaders, actually, and also leaders at all levels, especially at the local level. In local communities, we have to tailor initiatives to their needs, and that is the communities are always the basis for the rebuilding of trust. And we will have to start at the level of communities if we are to once again have public institutions which enjoy the trust of the people. Let me say, friends and colleagues, I'm convinced that every change also brings opportunities. and strong institutions led by responsible leaders will continue to have a vital role in the post-pandemic recovery. We don't need new bureaucracies, of course. We need a renewed commitment to meet the expectations of those we serve on values represented by our institutions. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who Dr. Rojas quoted, has called for a recovery and rescue package equal to about 10% of the global economy. That's a large amount. And we need to be especially conscious of those who are most distressed, the poorest countries. And you all know that 92 of our member states in the United Nations are severely distressed politically, economically, socially, and now with this whammy of this health distress. And unless we constantly think of these 92 countries, we are not going to design an exit policy which will work. Building back better seems to be the slogan of the day. And we need to build back better to transform the development model, building on strong institutions at its core, strengthening democratic governance, protection of human rights, and the rule of law. The root causes haven't gone away: inequality, political instability, displacement, and too many people, as I mentioned earlier, are feeling excluded, alone, and helpless. For me, building back better stands on 5 pillars. First is rebuilding and strengthening our public health systems. Nothing is going to work in the post-pandemic world if we don't fundamentally have a root and branch reform of our public health system. Second is doing what we can to put the SDGs back on track. Third, take climate action on a war footing, because that's the next crisis which is hovering at our doorstep, waiting to come in. Fourth, filling the finance and technology gap, where many solutions will exist to some of the problems that we faced. And finally, on digital cooperation and innovation. All our institutions should be guided by these 5 imperatives: public health, SDG implementation, climate change, finance and technology gap, and digital cooperation. I look forward to listening to all of you and thank once again the University for Peace and our Division of People, and look forward to listening to all you distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seth. And next, I would like to introduce Mr. Alex Mejia, the Director for the Division for People and Social Inclusion at UNITAR. Mr. Mejia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you, Excellencies, for joining us today as panelists. Thank you to the Honorable Rector of the University for Peace for his inaugural remarks, and thank you to my Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Seth, for his inaugural remarks as well. We have an impressive array of panelists, if I may. And before we give the floor to His Excellency, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, allow me to have a couple minutes just to put in perspective some of the things that we are talking about here. So the title, for those of you that just joined us, the title of this webinar, of course, is SDG 16, After the Pandemic, Policy and Strong Institutions, Making Our Societies More Resilient. So allow me, Julia, if I may, to show these very important introductory slides. These, dear friends, is exactly what SDG 16, the Sustainable Development Goal 16, has as targets. You all remember there are 17 goals, then we have 169 targets, and then we have 230 some indicators to monitor the advance of this roadmap that the world has embraced until the year 2030. Out of the 17 SDGs, the 116 on peace, justice, and strong institutions promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. If you see on the screen target 16.6, it actually says specifically that we need to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels in all sectors. And 16A at the bottom calls to strengthen relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation for building capacity at all levels. This is what the University for Peace does. This is what UNITAR attempts to do. We aim at building capacity in part to have better institutions. Next, please. So briefly, to show you some images. What has been the COVID impact from the point of view of the shock to the system that we have experienced, the test of the system, and the test of our values? Next, please. Mr. Seth just mentioned the numbers. Here you have the graph with the numbers. 160,773,000 confirmed cases as of yesterday, 3,375,000 dead. You see clearly the third wave around the world since the beginning of the pandemic more than a year ago. These numbers come from our colleagues at WHO. We are here in Geneva, very close to the Palais des Nations. The World Health Organization publishes the official information every day. This is taken from their dashboard. Next, please. So we all know, and the Honorable Rector and the Honorable Executive Director of UNITAR mentioned the impact on public health, and the economic impact, and the social and political impact. But if you look to the left, there is this expectation that this public health crisis that will take 1 or 2 years, God willing, will go away now that the vaccination campaigns are, of course, created immunity. But what happened after is what is complicated. Maybe 5 to 10 years of economic and unemployment and financial crisis, and then perhaps 20, 30 years, the equivalent of a generation of polarization and insecurity, and of a bigger north-south divide. I'm not going to read what you see in red there, but you can read for yourself. Is what is happening with poverty. The World Bank estimates that a total of 150 million people will have descended into poverty by the end of this year. Very sad indeed. Next. At the social level, we have already touched on disinformation as an effect, the impact on corruption, domestic violence, inclusion, and this crisis of leadership and trust that both Dr. Rojas and Mr. Seth just mentioned. Next, please. Here you see, this is from the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer that most of you will know, that there is record lows when it comes to trust, as Mr. Seth was just saying. The percentage that people trust in each one of these sources, traditional media, own media, social media, or search engines, is really low or going lower even. And it is very ironic for me to show you this slide of the last decade that is basically telling you that people believe more a computer and a search engine than a political leader on an actual editor of a newspaper. Next, please. Now, corruption, and the private sector has a great deal of ability to decrease the levels of corruption, but it takes two to tango, right? So this is a pandemic of its own for the public and the private sector alike. And if you can read on the screen what some experts believe is the impact of COVID-19 on corruption, the problems arise when emergency response to the virus with large amounts of funding and fast decision making leads to weak oversight, inadequate transparency, substandard procurement, low quality and falsified supplies, and abuse of supply chains. The end result, a weakened COVID-19 response. We will discuss later on from the perspective of the private sector and the public sector what to do here. Another negative effect is domestic violence. It's very sad for me to read these numbers. I'm sure you have heard them before. Even before the COVID-19, 1 in 3 women have already experienced domestic violence. It's a pandemic within a pandemic. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, rapid increase up to 50 or 60%, depending on how you measure, according to UN Women, in all types of violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence. This is a problem. Next, please. Inclusion. The percentage of people that agree, as you can see in these decreasing bars, with the following is preoccupied. So the pandemic deepens inequities around the world. The 62% of people on average agree that those with less education, less money, and fewer resources are being unfairly burdened with most of the suffering, risk of illness, and need to sacrifice due to the pandemic. Next, please. To continue with the impact that the COVID has beyond the public health numbers, beyond the economic numbers. Let me address lastly the crisis of leadership and trust. Societal leaders are not trusted to do what is right, and this is sad indeed. It comes from, again, the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer. Trust in societal leaders declines further, as you can see the numbers, when you go from government leaders, religious leaders, journalists, and CEOs. Having said so, the Edelman Trust Barometer found that after 1 year into the pandemic, the private sector leaders are more trusted than public sector leaders. We will get into that conversation soon. Next, please. This is a fascinating thing to analyze, because once these global, in the tens of thousands surveys that the Edelman Trust administer in 28 nations, I think the most populous of the world, after they compile the numbers and they put together this perspective, you see that business is perhaps the only institution that is seen as both competent and ethical. So you see the vertical axis from ethical to unethical, the horizontal axis from less competent to more competent, and you see where government is, unfortunately, where media is, unfortunately, where NGOs are, and where business is. Next, please. Vaccine hesitancy remains a major hurdle. Imagine, is this part of trust, as Mr. Seth was saying? Definitely yes. Only 64% of the people globally agree with taking the vaccine in the next year. And then you will see in the bars these two colors that basically say that people will vaccinate within 6 months to 1 year or immediately. So what happened with the other third of the global population? That's a question that we should discuss here later on. Next, please. To finalize, the questions that we postulate are the following. Number one, what are the main institutional risk threats of the current pandemic on our societies beyond health and economy? Number two, what are real-life examples on how institutions deal with them successfully? And number three, what should be the priorities of public and private institutions for a rapid post-COVID recovery? With that, let me finish this introduction, and let me now offer the floor to His Excellency Christian Guillermet Fernández, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Costa Rica. Bienvenido, señor ministro. Usted tiene la palabra. I think you are muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Now I'm here. Muchas gracias, Alex, and thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be with all of you in this virtual way. Please allow me to send you a real send of solidarity from San Jose, Costa Rica in those very difficult times and very challenging times. As I was saying, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share with you all my thoughts on SDG 16. And mostly because during the pandemic, if we had this path of sustainable development agree among all the nations as the Agenda 2030, we decide in the past that it's going to be the path that all the societies will work together to find the sustainable development. These pandemics cause a real challenge in the achievement of those goals. And I'm very pleased to participate today because I think that in those situations where we face real challenges, and I think that the pandemic was one of the most challenging times in our humanity, is probably an opportunity also for all of us to think in a different manner. And what I was thinking, preparing this webinar, is how important has been the SDG 16 in these difficult times. And I must say why. because the SDG 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And constantly in the fight against the pandemic is very important to follow not only the targets that we already had decided in the past, but how we can adapt the new demands of our people. Because as was saying, the pandemic is a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity in the sense that we need to discover, as Costa Rica did with a lot of other countries, that the only way to move forward to achieve the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, even it's not going to be in the 2030, is with the support of the multilateralists. A strong multilateralist is the best example of an SDG 16 with peace, justice, and strong institutions. And not only at the national level, and this is something that we need to really understand and to take as a lesson learned from this pandemic. We not only need strong institutions at the national level, but we need strong institutions at the national, regional, and the global way. It's not possible that we continue to fight war with the same tools that we have 1 century back. But it's not possible to continue to solve the situations that have been in the United Nations for more than 60 years. And we're still doing the same and trying to have different results. That's why, from our point of view, the pandemic being a tragedy, the loss of lives, the destruction of economies, and also a huge, huge impact on the sanitary all around the world. We need to think about different ways to do things. And probably one of these ways is to try to strengthen our multilateralism and how we can be in an infrastructure of more effective and with more impact. The conflict, insecurity, weak institutions, and limited access to justice remain the great threat to sustainable development. This is something that was before the pandemic, but is now so evident. It's so evident what we need to move forward and to do things. And how is not to reinvent the wheel, is only to look back on the SDGs, on the 169 targets and the 247 indicators for all the 17 SDGs. I think that the other thing that this pandemic brought to us in a very, very clear way is how important is to work in a frame of respect and promotion of human rights. This is the essence, the fundamental essence of any society, of any democratic society. But even if we cannot raise the issue of the democracy, let's try to have in this pandemic a view of respect and promotion and human rights. And this is giving access to sanitary services, but also giving the right to vaccines. This is the challenge This is the challenge on the day of today. How we can assure an SDG 16 moving for peace, justice, and strong institutions if our governments are not in the capacity, even the global institutions are not capable to give a global good as vaccines for everybody. I think that the best way to maintain the public support for the measure if for governance to the open and transparent way as must be the SDG 16 is to involve people in making decisions. It's what we call the civil participation. It's not new. It's not new. But we need to strengthen that. We need to find ways that the civil participation doesn't mean the social media. The social media is very good. It's very interesting. It was, but how the social media changed completely the way that we make policies and how it impacts in the SDG 16. This is something that probably we need to think about it. How the possibility of everybody to say the word in a democratic society is fundamental, is the best, is the dreaming society. But we are learning during the pandemics that is not true, because there is the fake news, and someone says the COVID is transmitting in some areas, and if you eat something, which is mean if you have fake news, social media, it goes against strong institutions, a strong democracy, peace, justice, and the liberal institutions for all. Allow me to finish with some talks again on the multilateralism. I think as Costa Rica and other countries is committed to the multilateral response to the multiple challenges that we are facing due to COVID-19 pandemic. We think that is in this titanic work, we need to seek solutions that widely benefits citizens, regardless of the country to which they belong. Our current problem affects our humanity as a whole. We need to work to offer the world a particular way of understanding international relations based on the principles of peace, human rights, development, cooperation, dialogue, solidarity. As Costa Rica is trying to do today in concrete ways to implement SDG 16 at its national level, but also working for this implementation at the international level. Thank you very much, and very pleased to be invited today to join in this interesting webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Excellency. It's quite an honor to have you with us and to hear your comments, indeed, on the need to renew multilateralism and the institutional capacities that we have with this pandemic. You have made us think deeply, and I will remain grateful for that. Very good. To continue with this quite unique conversation, let me now invite our next speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Lubna Kassim, Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations Office at Geneva. It's quite an honor to have you, Ambassador, and it's quite refreshing to get to hear from you. We know you at UNITAR, and we are always honored that you decided to join us. So the floor is yours, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Alex. And of course, I can't begin without thanking UNITAR and the University for Peace for convening this very important, timely roundtable discussion on the public policy and institutions in this post-COVID era. On behalf of the permanent mission of United Arab Emirates in Geneva, I'm extremely pleased to participate in this enriching debate during a very critical period along all my fellow panelists. The COVID-19, no doubt, pandemic has had devastating spillover effects worldwide, ranging from civil unrest and reaction to stark inequalities laid bare by the crisis, to spike in gender-based and domestic violence during lockdowns, to declining levels of trust, as Nikhil very well mentioned, in government in the face of an overreach of an emergency powers and heavy-handed security responses. Disastrous as it is, this crisis can also pave the way towards a more resilient future. As both His Excellency Fernandez and also His Excellency Rector mentioned, every challenge presents an opportunity. And of course, it has provided an opportunity for every government to reflect on the kind of public institutions and governance mechanisms that need to be in place for our societies to be able to withstand similar shocks in the future. In this regard, it is important to mention that the pandemic has exposed the benefits of a stronger, flexible, and a more responsive civil service which can incorporate risk management and has access to contingencies in an emergency. It demonstrated the need for sound procurement policies, including sustainable development, systems, and processes. There's also a need to adapt to models of government operations, service delivery, and interaction with citizens more than ever. And I'd like to share my country's experiences, United Arab Emirates experiences, to face these very complex circumstances due to the pandemic and explore the adopted new ways to overcome the situation. With a constructive spirit, aiming to turn challenges into opportunities, including governance with SDG 16 at its center, I'd like to highlight two positive responses from the government and the national and local institutions. UAE government organized a meeting in May, not very long after the pandemic hit the world, last year in 2020, at the highest level, to develop a strategy for the whole of government, a federal government working system, producing business plans, policies, and means to ensure the short, medium, and long-term development of the UAE's government work, to enable the country to tackle the economic and social post-COVID-19 challenges. The 6 main areas which UAE focused for the meeting were health, education, economy, food security, society, and government. Ministers presented their vision and the UAE's readiness for the future of the set sectors in the post-COVID-19 stage. The outcome of the meeting was very proactive, but also very result-oriented. The EU reviewed the structure and size of its government as part of its strategy for dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, and merged ministries and alter bodies, and will make changes for a more agile, flexible, and a speedy government. The goal of the structural changes within the government was mainly to enhance faster decision-making and up-to-date changes. The new structure aimed at the government in seizing opportunities and in dealing with the new stage in our history. It reflected a flexible and a fast government whose goal was to consolidate the achievements and gains of the country. In the field of the education, higher education institutions were quick to innovate following the outbreak of the virus, and universities in adapting the courses to suit the national needs. And let me share, within the 2 weeks of when the pandemic hit, like anywhere else in the world, UAE was able to migrate 1.2 million students from a physical platform to a virtual platform. And in rural areas where children did not have access to internet, we set up free satellite servers, operations, where children had access to internet 24/7. And because, again, education, we all know, plays an important part. And of course, the pandemic disrupted and paralyzed every single industry. But one thing we did not want to leave behind were the children and the education. And regulatory bodies in education, now this is something which we're also working on, are setting up more transformative changes to traditional schooling, developing innovative solutions such as training parents as teachers in order to change systems proactively rather than reacting to unexpected circumstances. As out-of-classroom learning becomes more widespread, students and parents will become more involved in designing both learning tools and the teaching curriculum. We're also working to integrate this new reality in our policies and programs. And I'll focus on two areas beyond health and economy. Firstly, UAE is currently working to adopt a new sustainability commitment, mainly by creating a baseline for future curbs on greenhouse gases, investigating the possibility of ramping up its environment strategy and reducing the need for polluting modes of transport and energy consumption and avoid a return to them in a post-COVID-19 world. We're also reflecting on new standards in social care, mainly by developing social care services regulations for identifying those in need of social support, along with policies and standards to ensure that there is facilitating compatibility between education, social care professionals, and training provided and requirements for any licensing in this field. More globally, I want to think that we need to set up key priorities, as my other fellow panelists mentioned, which may help us to prevent crises and disasters, mostly by enhancing national, regional, and global cooperation mechanisms that include all sectors and segments of society. We can't leave anyone behind. Strengthening preparedness and resilience to crisis and systemic shocks. Reviewing and assessing regularly the operating models in the different fields and sectors. Ensuring closer collaboration and dialogue with all stakeholders in a transparent manner to guarantee real-time communication and proactive responses. Strengthening social and cultural structures and adopting an inclusive social policies to avoid social disparities. I can't conclude without reiterating the importance of multilateral diplomacy. The entire humanity is undergoing a very critical and a delicate period. And clearly this pandemic has exposed and also reiterated the importance and urges us all to work in a more cooperative manner, in a more transparent manner. So multilateral diplomacy has always been extremely important, but even more so than ever before. Finally, I reiterate the involvement of UAE in the international efforts to enhance the transparent and adequate governance at the different levels, especially in the international arena. I thank you all and look forward to receiving and hearing all your inputs. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Excellency. Indeed, a very holistic way to describe how you see the situation. And particularly, thank you for sharing the experience of the UAE, an example in many settings. I have heard before how you managed in a few days to move more than 1 million students to virtual education. And that became an example last year for very many other countries. So thank you for that. And thank you for your support to the mission of the United Nations. Without further ado, and before I introduce the next speaker, we know that His Excellency, the Deputy Minister, will have to leave soon. I simply wanted to say in my mother tongue, a big muchas gracias for joining us today. Excellency, we wish you the best.
Muchas gracias, and thank you very much. I was very pleased, and please invite me again. I will be very pleased to do it again. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Muchas gracias, señor Mejía. Buen día. Hasta luego.
Gracias. Buen día. Adiós. Bye. Very good. So next, it's quite an honor to have a representative of the private sector, one of the titans of industries, as we call him, giving this very important perspective from the other side, if I may. The private sector is indeed part of the solution and very active already on what the COVID efforts and vaccination campaigns have been, and particularly preparing for the post-COVID era. So without further ado, I would like to offer the floor to Mr. Gustavo Gori, Chief Supply Chain Officer of Kimberly-Clark Corporation. Mr. Gori, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. I don't know if I can fulfill the title of a titan on this arena, but I will try my best to contribute to this discussion. I have to start by saying thank you again for the invitation, but very importantly, I've been inspired already with the other conversations from the panelists and the honorary guests and host of this event. So thank you so much. It's been fantastic. We're talking SDG 16 today, but this slide here is a very impactful one because we seem to be worried about the same things, everybody, which is a very important point of my conversation today. If we are really worried about the same, why is that we're not working together to solve it? And I will leave that reflection on the table for a little while, and probably I will take it again in the conversation later. But this slide that talks about the 17 SDGs, to me represents the source of inspiration that private industry could take to create purpose-driven enterprise. And it's been with us for a while, and maybe not everybody has taken on the opportunity to move their private enterprise into a purpose-driven business. To me, I would like to list that as one of the very specific, pragmatic things we could do to start addressing this issue that we have. Because a purpose-driven enterprise requires purpose-driven leaders. And exactly that's one of the gaps that we are discussing today, how much of not-best leadership we have seen during this period of our history. So this is really, really, really important. Julia, we can move up. Next slide, please. This, I don't know if we have made this experiment, but I'm pretty sure we have 60 plus people in this discussion today, and I don't know where they're coming from, where are their roles, where they're playing in society, but who could say that we don't want to be in an environment of peace, where rule of law guides decisions, where freedom, equality, anti-corruption, and justice frames the action of everyone in society? Well, private sector is interested in places that are like that. And certainly we do have a responsibility of driving that together in a way that really creates the prosperity that we should all be driven by. Solution number 2, why don't we move towards the concept of prosperity in an integrated way, and we all buy into the concept of driving that prosperity with tangible building blocks. So in the context of this goal, the private sector has a very important ingredient to put in play. So we understand the role of government in health, in justice, in many aspects, education. Do we understand that we have a big obligation and a big responsibility to contribute to those plans? And furthermore, do we understand that because we are a source of big employment and socioeconomic development and growth, we should play a bigger role in putting our efforts, talents, and capabilities into play for that as well? Big questions that I put down on the table for us to analyze and move towards a different level, a different way of leadership in the game. Julia, can you move up? So look at this interesting slide, some statistics that are very, very, very telling. And this is a true statement. We want to play where all these grand ideals and aspects of the society are in place. So when they are not in place, we are hesitant. We are hesitant. So there is an obligation to really create that infrastructure, this environment where we feel confident and we have trust to put our investments into. So it's not only the market requirements that makes us invest, it's also the conditions under which our investments will be playing around. And are we making sense of it? Do we really are gonna drive our purpose by doing it? Importantly, this is probably the core slide of the whole deck, because it's talking really how to orchestrate it. We understand our obligation. We understand the responsibility of each side, the public sector, the private sector, but what are we doing to really create this mutual strength that we can enhance with just working it together? And that requires solution number 3, a new standard of leadership, a new way to look at leadership. Good leaders are not just the ones that know how to do very well something and drive people towards that, but it's also people that orchestrate the real components of every enterprise and every effort that we do together to drive the purpose that we were talking before. In this case, I will submit prosperity as a purpose. Unfortunately, most of the problems that we're talking today were with us before the pandemic. It's simply that we didn't take advantage of many resources that were around us to anticipate them when they happen. And they caught us by surprise. They caught us by surprise. That's very much a failure of us as leaders, driving what we have to do and creating infrastructure we need to create and being capable of managing the challenges of the unknown. And we should do much better on that front for sure. Julia, I'd like you to go back to that one, to the prior one. There is a consequence, immediate consequence of the pandemic. It created new expectations on people. And this slide is very, very telling in regards to expectations from CEOs and private industry individuals. We do play a role, and we did play a role, but how much more and better we could have done if we have done something different in preparation of? Leave that question also on the table. Julia, can you move on? Look at this new expectation as well, quality. We knew this trend. This was happening. We know that our consumers, our societies, our people expecting better from us in terms of what do we do in the area of quality and how transparently we manage it. And I want to mention that word transparency because the other day, Alex challenged us to think about what are the 2 or 3 things that worries you the most. Transparency is one of them, Alex, to me. The lack of transparency when you are dealing with a common ground objective and you're still not transparent enough to do it. And that's the way we operate today. That has to change because the pandemic didn't create those problems. It unveiled the need to change even further. And it makes it dramatically important that we act, it's a call to action to really do something different and not continue with the norms that today we accept are okay. Next. So I believe I preempted this one. This is what the COVID did for us. If anything, I know there is a lot of pain. We have lived through the worst of society is being exposed to us. And it was triggered by this enemy that we haven't tackled yet. But importantly, I would say, let's look at this as the opportunity we are given once more to lead in a different way and create a change that is tangible. Next. Of course, this is an interesting slide that shows the good work, quote unquote, we've done. But the question is how much faster and better we could have done it. How much of this could be even prevented and anticipated? And I don't want the answers to that question, but I want the question to expose us to the fact that we really, as leaders, could do something different in that respect. Being in the public or in the private. But more importantly, if we are all agreeing that the ultimate objective is prosperity, there should not be discussion that we have a role to play together. And this slide could be way better than what it is. Way more impressive. Now, as always, of course, the pandemic lowered the bar. Because we have a depressed society, a depressed economy. But the good thing is that there is a kind of a hope at least in leadership minds, that the perspective is better. And this one, you see how you see the executive looking at it in general. It seems to be more positive than it's been in the last 12 to 18 months. The next slide will show you the same perspective from different economies. And the next slide will tell you also from the perspective of employment. So using only 3 very small indicators that there is something going on that is positive. There is a feeling of positive perspective on the economy. But I hope we don't fail again to play from the perspective of good leadership, new leadership, transformational leadership, transparent leadership that is purpose-driven and that can change the game for the future. So we are not trapped again on an illusion of a better economy, which could be very much a short-term only mirage. That's all I have to say today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gori, for giving us that perspective from the private sector. And indeed, we are all in this together. We cannot do it alone, either if you are in the public or in the private. And we need to increase cooperation. And there are indeed some good examples already of cooperation when it comes to vaccination. But as you say, it could have been a lot better. And I couldn't agree more. Now, on this last slide, we all understand that anyone listening here today from very many countries, we saw the registrations, do understand that the greatest capacity for economic recovery and for generation of jobs, for the creation of jobs to avoid unemployment, comes from the private sector. So the private sector is indeed at the center of the solution. So thank you for that. Thank you to Kimberly-Clark Corporation, and thanks to you, Mr. Gori, for this most outstanding presentation. Let me now go to our next speaker, my dear friend and colleague, Adriana Alverti, who is speaking from New York. Thank you, Adriana, for joining us kind of early. Allow me to introduce you properly. Ms. Alverti is the Chief of the Capacity Development Unit at Public Institutions Division of DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations, at the UN Secretariat in that beautiful flat building that we all know in New York. So thank you, Adriana, again. The floor is yours. We are very pleased to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex, for this kind invitation. And excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure to join you in this very timely and relevant panel on SDG 16. I wish to thank UNITAR and the University of Peace for this commendable initiative. So far, it has been quite interesting and very rich discussions. So in my presentation today, next please, I will look at 3 key questions. The first one, and some of the, of course, issues have already been raised by the fellow panelists. What are the risks of the pandemic on our societies? What does a new normal look like? And if we can call it a new normal, and what are the priorities for sustainable recovery? And how can the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs support countries in strengthening their governance capacities to recover in the post-COVID era? Next. So what are the risks? We already heard some statistics, but I just wanted to add that based on a report from the UN Statistics Division, for the first time, the pandemic has caused an increase in global poverty in decades. 71 million were pushed into extreme poverty in 2020, and we also heard about the data for 2021. 4 billion people did not benefit from any form of social protection. And as we know, the most vulnerable groups are the ones that have been hit hardest by this pandemic. So COVID-19 has emerged as an unpredictable, complex crisis. And so one of the key challenges for governments is how to enhance their capacity to address complexity, uncertainty, and also interconnectedness of the public challenges. The pandemic, as fellow panelists have also underscored, has exposed weaknesses especially in public institutions, and it has uncovered inequalities within many societies. The United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has said that the pandemic has uncovered a new inequality pandemic. So the current pandemic has really challenged government as usual, and we heard that already. And this is not just in developing countries, but across the world. We also heard from other panelists that there is an enhanced distrust in governments in their caused by inability to deliver services quickly, promptly, with quality, and by involving people. And we also heard that there is a rising in populism across many countries, where populists have identified some of the key challenges and fears, but the responses of xenophobia, nationalism, isolation are not going to lead to the implementation of the 2030 agenda and to the recovery from the COVID-19. So as you see here, this is just a human story, because sometimes, you know, numbers don't really give us the right or the complete perspective. So this is the case of a family that is struggling, you know, one of the vulnerable groups living in poverty, where you have a mother that has contracted COVID-19, the father is unemployed, there are 8 children, there is a lack of access to the internet. The brother, sorry, go back, Julia. Brother has disability. So oftentimes, how does public administration respond to these kinds of very complex crises? Julia, can you go back? Sorry. Thank you. Lack of empathy, low transparency. Many agencies are dealing with different aspects, health, food, schooling, but they work in silos. There are top-down solutions. So vulnerable groups often are not consulted in what it is that they really need. And this leads to conflicting interventions and high cost with a low impact. Next. Sorry, previous one. Yes. So what are the priorities for a sustainable recovery from the pandemic? We already heard many very good issues raised by fellow panelists, and I will just build on what they have said. So number one of the key messages from the UN Committee of Experts on Public Administration is that the recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and the implementation of the SDGs are not separate, are not sequential, but they go hand in hand. Actually, the 2030 agenda provides the blueprint to recover from COVID-19. And achieving sustainable development will require, as others have also highlighted, strengthening long-term perspectives in policymaking together with institution building, which can be based and framed along the 11 principles of effective governance for sustainable development that the Economic and Social Council has endorsed in 2018. Second, a better normal calls for a deep reflection of what type of communities we wish to live in. And I have seen this echoed across all presentations. So governments and people need to rethink what a good society looks like and the values upon which our societies are built, and therefore a social contract. And as others have already highlighted, in the past, crises have heralded opportunities, and this is an opportunity that we must take to pause and to reflect on the values that we wish to promote in our societies, not just for our present generations, but for future generations. And we have seen, sadly, that values such as individualism, inequality, disrespect for the environment, and the primacy of economic gain at the expense of social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development have made this crisis worse. The third priority is embracing a new understanding of what progress is, and this also ties into the second point, and how it should be measured. So again, focusing on GDP alone as a measure of progress has not allowed countries to promote development that is sustainable. But again, we have an incredible opportunity to promote a green economy and to also help avert the next crisis, as Mr. Seth said, which is climate change. Number 4, we don't need just a shift in values, societal values, but we also need a shift in mindsets, meaning beliefs and attitudes towards building a society where everyone contributes as much as possible to promote a decent life for all. There should be by now an increasing realization that our lives are deeply interconnected, and what happens to one person affects everyone. So values of solidarity and empathy are critical within public service, but they are critical across society and all institutions. And socially conscious leadership at all levels of government and sectors is essential to recover from the pandemic. Fifth, recovering from the pandemic will require effective, inclusive, and accountable institutions at all levels, both national and local. And here I would like to stress the local level, because the COVID-19 has underscored the importance of local authorities as first responders to the crisis, and therefore they will continue to play a very important role. 6, innovation. Innovation, we already heard that. Innovation, transformation in public service at all levels will be critical, and involving people in decision-making. And I would like to add involving vulnerable groups, and especially also reaching out to the youth. The youth has to play a very important role in building a new society. Now, Julia has kindly shared this slide. So building back better will require new capacities, new governance capacities across a number of key areas. And these are the areas that UNDESA, together with schools of public administration, and also together with UNITAR, we've been working on developing different capacity development activities. And this is one of them, which is a curriculum on governance for the SDGs. And the key governance dimensions will help to build resilient government institutions. The first one is changing mindsets. And as I mentioned, in order to transform our world, we must transform ourselves, our beliefs, and our attitudes. And this applies to public servants as much as it applies to all of us. So for example, adopting a learning mindset, the capacity to anticipate problems through strategic foresight and planning are fundamental. Transformational leadership, we heard, is required at all levels, and I would say socially conscious leadership, and maybe add environmentally conscious leadership. So this is extremely important. Transparency and ethics are critical to rebuild trust in government and prevent corruption, which is a tragedy because it robs countries of resources that could go into sustainable development. Institutional arrangements for policy coherence, so building the capacity for interministerial coordination is key, and for data-centric decisions, effective to national, local public governance, And we know that coordination among central and local government levels is essential in recovering from the pandemic, but also in averting crisis in the future. And we have seen in many countries the disconnect between the national and the local level, and how if there had been more integration, responses would have been faster and lives would have been saved. Government innovation for social inclusion. As we have seen, COVID-19 has worsened inequality. So we need policies for social inclusion, co-creation, co-production. Our previous panelist also mentioned that it is important to enlist people in decision-making and building people, public-private people partnerships. Partnerships are going to be fundamental in getting us out of the crisis and building a better future. Risk-informed governance, innovation and digital government. And here, let me just add that COVID-19 has become the new driver for digital transformation. So capacity is needed to leverage technologies to govern better and provide services while minimizing the risks. And there are many risks. And so these should always be taken into account. I would like to mention that UNDESA has published in 2020 the UN government survey. It also has an annex, an addendum on the COVID-19 and digital government, as well as a compendium on digital initiatives to address COVID-19, which are available on the UN Public Administration Network website if you're interested to see what different countries have done. Finally, e-government for women's empowerment. Again, we know that the COVID-19 has had major negative effects on women and girls with an increase in domestic violence. So making sure that women have a say, making sure that women can assume leadership positions is very important to also address gender issues. Next, please. So these various capacity development training toolkits, which are for different types of courses, whether online or whether face-to-face, are available on the UN Public Administration Network website. This is a network of over 33 institutions. If you're interested in learning more about what UNDESA is doing on SDG 16 and on the capacity development work, I invite you to visit the UNPAN website. And I would like to conclude by saying that SDG 16 indeed will play a fundamental role in the recovery, that strengthening governance and institutions' capacities will be essential to ensure future preparedness for similar crises. But I would also like to underscore that effective governance depends on us all. Our collective actions will matter in building better societies and embarking on the transformational change that is needed to overcome present and future challenges and bridge and the way towards sustainable development for all. So if there's one message that I would like to leave you all with is we need to think about what each one of us in their own sector can do to promote prosperity for all. Thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Alex.
Thanks to you, dear Adriana, and thanks to UNDESA, and particularly to your division for sharing all these resources, for making it very tangible and beneficial for the people that are listening today. But before we go to the next speaker, let me just echo something that you say. Indeed, we have to empower, we have to learn, we have to build capacity. And in this particular case, because of the important work that you do, public administrations remain critical for the post-COVID recovery. And as you say, in concluding, we are all in this together. We have an obligation and a duty to help, particularly developing nations, and UNPAN and your division, as I say, and your section are doing that job very well. Congratulations, and thank you for joining us from New York. Now, last but not least, a great friend of ours, Professor Emeritus Mike Sachs, is speaking from the United Kingdom. will now take the floor. But before you begin, Mike, if I may, I want to recognize Professor Sachs because he really welcomed an idea 3 years ago now, I believe, to create an institute for responsible leadership out of London. It is thanks to Professor Sachs and his team that this institute actually exists and is doing a great, impressive work out of the UK. So with those words of recognition, Professor Sachs, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Alex, thank you for your warm words as ever. They're very much appreciated. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak here amongst some highly valued colleagues from whom I've learned a lot already. I want to speak about something in SDG 16 after the pandemic that hasn't really been mentioned an awful lot, which is the importance of professional groups. So I think, Alex, you actually mentioned this in your slide on, with reference to scientists and journalists and so on, who might be called professions. But I want to extend this further because I think professions can actually form the kind of cement that can bring things together in the future post-pandemic. And here I would just very quickly skip over this slide because basically I just wanted to highlight that unlike the other speakers, I have a very wide university background, being on the executive board of 6 universities. I've been involved with companies in both the private and the public sector as, chair, CEO. I've been involved with NHS committees, and I particularly valued my role in advising governments and professions over many years. And I would like to think too that I've made, as Alex has said, a contribution, a very small contribution to the development of the UN in this particular area of SDG 16. And I am very proud of being chair of the Institute for Responsible Leadership, and more of that later, inevitably. But what I would like to say is that the UN's SDG 16 aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, that we've already heard about, and build effective, accountable and inclusive institutions. And I think that the professions have been a much neglected institution in this process. And I think they can play a key part in realizing SDG 16. So I'm really illustrating this primarily with reference to societies like Britain and the United States, but this also applies, I think, more generically. I mean, it certainly applies to Canada, Australia, Germany, which have ring-fenced professional groups, but I think it applies also to low and middle-income societies as well. The issue with professions is they've faced huge challenges over the last few years. People have lost trust in professions. I mean, that's basically the scenario. And there's been a lot of discussion about trust. And I want to argue that actually with reform, with their long-standing ethical codes and responsible leadership, they can now play a critical role in society in leading us out of the COVID crisis. And I say, when I talk about professions, I talk about professions in both the public and the private sector. And I was particularly uplifted by Gustavo's contribution, because I do think the two sectors are like peas in a pod and they sit alongside each other and work together. So next slide, please, Julia. So just as a context, I mean, professions have really gone from heroes to villains, because in the 1940s and 50s, people put professions like accountancy, law, medicine, and so on a pedestal. And they were seen as being, wonderful organizations which had high income, status, and power. And they were widely endowed with characteristics like altruism, serving the public interest, and expert knowledge. And indeed, some classic contributors like Carr, Saunders, and Wilson actually saw them as bastions of democracy. But however, in the last 50 years, there have been increasing attacks on professions. And I think we need to get beyond these. But basically, in the counterculture, they were seen as, having real limits, to their progressive approach. They were seen as perhaps being organizations that could be bypassed for better solutions, particularly in relation to depersonalization and disempowerment, which was a common experience of dealing with professions at this time. And indeed, it was felt that consumers and users should exercise greater control over their lives. Next slide, please. The situation actually got worse. And what we've seen in recent times, in contemporary times, is growing public scandals in the professions. I mean, the role of auditors in not actually appropriately appraising banks who were not lending on a secure basis, which prompted the 2008 financial crisis, which damaged us all for 10 years and more. The rise of a nihilistic postmodern ideology about professions. Well, we don't need to go to professions because we can get all the advice and knowledge we need on the internet. The support for a free market, unobstructed by professional monopolies, as in medicine, you know, this has also been rife. You know, the idea that, oh, we should have more people practicing as doctors. You know, if we didn't have these constraints, we will be able to have more creative approaches to healthcare knowledge. However, I have argued here that these challenges have actually led to growing threats to professions through citizens and clients, because citizens and clients have sought an extension of choice and voice through more public engagement, through greater consumer involvement and self-responsibility. The state has also posed a major challenge because the state has increasingly intervened to constrain professions to protect the public against what it perceives as professional malpractice and provide a more regularized standard. Indeed, corporations and organizations in the private and public sector it is held a sort of debilitating effect on professions because there's been increasing bureaucracy and increasing constraint on what professions can do in an untrammeled way. Now, why should we trust these groups in terms of going forward in relation to the pandemic? Well, while they no longer seem to be a helpful institution, I've actually argued that on the contrary, there have been major reforms which have provided more public and private accountability for professions. The professions have these long-standing ideologies of serving the public interest, and these remain central to society. And to disestablish them, as the free marketeers suggest, would not actually be helpful. This is because basically it will remove the protection of the certified expertise and codes of ethics that they bring. It would lead to the principle of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, when people don't necessarily have trusted information available, even on the internet. You know, this can be quite challenged, you know, in relation to fake news. And indeed, you know, if we got rid of professions, we'd introduce huge amounts of bureaucracy and cost in running the matters that they dealt with. And indeed, we would destroy the public interest buffer between professions and the state and corporations. Often the professions have served as major supporters of humanity, particularly in medicine and other fields, in publishing valued and trusted information. However, Leaked argues that professions will need to shift still further if they're going to play a key institutional role in resurrecting society after the pandemic. This applies to a number of issues, including the receptiveness to technological change, which hasn't always been great in the past. Their new role as mediators and managers of risk in a risk society. Their capacity as trusted interpreters of information, not necessarily suppliers, but interpreters. And their greater role in empowering and partnering users, making more constructive and creative engagement with corporations. Very, very important that we're all working together. The acceptance of public interest accountability to the state, and less emphasis on their self-interested approach to issues and the prevalence of this in dealing with these. I also believe that professions have a role as positive promoters of change in the new era. And I think that a lot of this is illustrated by the health professions, and particularly the way they've actually dealt with COVID-19, the response they've made. And we see many self-sacrificing professions who expose themselves to tremendous risks in relation to COVID-19 in order to serve the public good and to save people from a terrible fate in relation to mortality and long-standing morbidity following the contraction of COVID-19. Next slide, please. It's important, though, that professions, if they're going to fulfill this tremendous role, whether it's accountants, lawyers, or doctors, more fully engage in responsible leadership. And Kempster and Carroll, in a recent book, have set out the following indicators of responsible leadership. I don't intend to go through them all, but basically they relate to having a social responsibility. They relate, as has been said by other speakers, to actually applying responsible leadership at all levels, the individual, the team, organization, and society. They relate to taking a shareholder focus, but going beyond this in also assuming a stakeholder perspective, which is very important. Ethics are key. Getting on top of global intercultural issues, and indeed being humanitarian, having a purpose, sharing opinions, and connecting stakeholders together is all very important at a time of disruption and at a time when so many are still taking a short-term shareholder view. Next slide. However, to facilitate the achievement of the responsible leadership necessary, it's important that there is a grasp of the United Nations SDGs as a whole, the 17 SDGs, including centrally SDG 16, as has been said. And I think that it must be said that the Institute for Responsible Leadership, which I chair, actually strongly supports all the SDGs, and it is a not-for-profit organization which hopes to contribute to making the world a better place post-COVID-19. And its touchstone remains that responsible leaders in both the private and public sector actually treat stakeholders with integrity to ensure that issues of sustainability, ethics, and the wider public interest are best addressed. So this is really important. And to do this, we actually have the following principles, working very closely with UNITAR. We promote leadership integrity. We offer courses, seminars, publications, accreditation, mentoring, coaching, and research support. And we also provide high quality input and facilitation through our founding members and key examples of responsible leadership through associates. In addition, we publicize our fellowships as examples of good practice. We promote a charter on responsible leadership for companies and organizations. And if anyone involved in this broadcast is interested, our chief executive is Julie Search Whitaker, email address listed, and the web address of the IRL is www.responsibleleadership.org. And if we go on to the final slide, if anyone is interested in a further development of the idea of professions and their key idea being a key idea for business and society in the future, I have just published a book on this, a very accessible book, which talks about the importance of professions and professionalism as an integral part in business and society, which looks not only at the history of such groups and the recent challenges that they've faced, but it provides a concise overview that will point towards the future role that professions in all areas, from this could include, human resources, human resource management, it could include management consultancy and other areas, but, also very much addresses the role of groups like doctors, lawyers, and accountants, and the way that they can actually drive society forward in the future. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks to you, Professor Sachs. It's always very gratifying for us to have an academician of your level with us. Thank you for mentioning the Institute for Responsible Leadership that you co-lead with Julia, our dearest colleague. And particularly, thank you for sharing your vast experience on what is it that professions should also be understood as in this post-recovery. Before we go, and before I wrap up this excellent conversation so far, this panel proper within this webinar, allow me also to say that what we wanted to ensure today is to give you different perspective. You see, when we are at the United Nations, and I have been, it's been a great honor in my career, more than a decade already with the UN, we tend to see things only from the perspective of the public sector, only from the perspective of governmental international organizations. We wanted to go beyond that, and I hope we have achieved it. We wanted to give you perspectives from the private sector, from academia, and from many other instances in which we have to relay and trust for the recovery. So this leads me to some concluding remarks before passing the floor to Ambassador David Fernandez for the closing. And simply on behalf of UNITAR, I would like to thank my team for putting this together with the team at the University for Peace, and to thank the panelists. It's been my great pleasure to moderate this thing, and to you, dear participants from around the world, I do hope that we have fulfilled your expectations with all the things that have been said today. Thank you from my side, and now for the concluding remarks, Ambassador David Fernandez. David, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alex. In any case, one of the main challenge is to make a concluding remarks and to make a summary of these innovative solutions and ideas or distinguished speakers have been provided to us. I would like maybe to make 5 points, to remarks 5 points. First of all, I agree with Mr. Alex. This panel has been a really good combination from the private and public sector, coming and from the UN system, and we have distinguished colleagues from New York, from UN DESA, to national governments, the case of the Costa Rica and UAE, and we cannot forget, of course, the private sector and academia. In this sense, the speakers, they have refreshed with the main challenges posed by the post-pandemic society. As I say before, they have already provided, innovative solutions. It's important to say based on the experience on the United Nations system and the scientific research. I think I have confessed we have, really personally had a very inspirational contributions. This is, I really learned a lot about your experience, and in particular also our distinguished speakers clarify the main targets for a better and sustainable recovery. I have been taking some notes here, but maybe I don't know, we have short of time. But I would like only to make a summary of some of them. For instance, the idea and importance of trust. This is a key element. Another important setback for recovery is the corruption. We need to fight against corruption. We have a lot of work to do, as for the global vaccination. It's important to stress the notion of solidarity, compassion, political responsibility, good governance, rule of law, and human rights. As Mr. Nikhil said, this crisis is also a test about our values and principles ingrained in the United Nations chapter. We are living in a times of populism and misinformation, and we need to rebuild the trust. Mr. Alex gave us an important, very substantive PowerPoint about the these challenges and the challenges on the human development. What we need more is multilateralism. We need to strengthen the multilateral organizations. As our ministers say, human rights are central for this recovery. Every challenge provide an opportunity, and for that, Excellency Lubna provide us with some examples from UAE. Mr. Gustavo Gori also remarked the important role played by the enterprises, and we need leaders and COE leaders in this post-pandemic society. And as he said, I think it's important political stability and rule of law and more cooperation. Ms. Adriana Alverti from UNDESA provide us with the main risk of the pandemic. She said that the increase of poverty, the lack of social protection, the increase, as I said before, populism, xenophobia, isolation, huge debts, and children at risk. And also she clarified to us, the main priorities. She said that we need to be more people-centered leadership. We need leadership, accountability, transparency, empathy, and the role played by women and the youth. And finally, Professor Sachs, he remarked the role played by the health professionals. Really, they have been an example in all these month of pandemic, and the importance of social responsibility is also needed. I don't want to extend more, only I would like then to thank very much Honorable Professor Francisco Rojas, Excellency Nikhil, Excellency Christian Guillermet, Excellency Lubna Qasim, Mr. Gustavo Gori, Ms. Adriana Alverti, and Professor Sachs. And in particular, I want to thank very much and deeply the coordination of Ms. Julia Gens. Thank you, Ms. Julia, and of course, my good friend, Mr. Alex Mejia, for this sound moderation that really we have enjoyed with your work. Thank you, all of you. I wish you all the best. We need to work together. We need more cooperation, and see you soon. And thank you, UNITAR, for this cooperation. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.